All right, welcome to Lecture 10, Chapter number 10 for the Kinesiology 158 Motor Learning and Control class. In this lecture, we're going to talk about instructions and demonstrations. So in the context of learning motor skills, instructions and demonstrations are kind of a big deal, right? Most types of skills are learned more effectively, more quickly, and more sort of thoroughly when instructions provided. So either visual or verbal, and we'll talk about both today. So we'll talk about those types of instruction. We'll talk about some of the characteristics needed for optimum instruction. We'll even talk about things like the characteristics of the model providing the instruction. So not only what you say and how you say it, but who you are can make a difference, or whomever says it. So those are some of the main topics we'll hit up in this discussion. So as you already know, adequate learning definitely involves a little bit of help, right? We can learn some things on our own, but to get to mastery sort of levels, oftentimes a little bit of instruction can go a long way. Instruction should be based in sound theory and reliable empirical evidence. In other words, you shouldn't just have a hack of sorts providing instruction. So subjective experiences, intuition, which is a pretty common sort of strategy. Oh, I just think it's right, so this is how you should do it kind of thing. Tradition, emulation, those tend to be, at least research tells us, right, that tend to be quite ineffective compared to someone who is providing instruction based on the science, right? Some of the real stuff. So let's talk about verbal instructions. So they are intended to tell a learner what to think and what to do. This is what you're going to be doing, and while you're doing it, this should be the process going on, right? You know all about verbal instructions. An effective verbal instruction is tailored to the needs of the situation, right? And so that's an important skill of the instructor, is to understand this situation, understand the learner, understand the environment, the task at hand, all that good stuff, and tailor the verbal instruction to meet those needs. You're not going to tell a group of 5-year-old basketball players the intricacies of some sort of complex dribbling skill, crossover drill, layup kind of thing with all these verbal sort of, details. You want to keep it simple. Whereas for the higher level learners, college basketball players, you can get that into the verbal description of a skill. As usual, probably not the best not the best example. Some inherent features in verbal instruction, the amount of information, the features of the skill, the outcome for attentional focus, right? You want to tell your learner those types of things. How much information is appropriate? Well, depends. Again, it depends on your learner. Generally, assume they have a limited attentional capacity, then maybe 2 to 3 performance elements at a time, right? Don't give a list of 10 or 15 things to accomplish, especially that first time through. Here's 2 or 3 things, do those. Be brief and be to the point, especially for the early learners, right? In watching, my kids play sport and playing sport myself and being around those types of coaching situations, I've seen situations where coaches of youth sport, spend 15, 20 minutes to a younger age group talking about strategies or skill development, trying to obviously improve the performance of the team, but getting way beyond sort of being brief and to the point about learning a certain set of skills or ideas. So that's an important concept. Knowing your audience is really key there. The precision of information. So, what level of preciseness do you need to get to be most effective, right? Do you need to give the split hair difference details, or is it just generalizations? You're doing a lab on this, I think. The beanbag toss one. There will be some feedback and that kind of stuff, and you'll be asked during that lab, if you haven't already done it, to give various types of feedback, quantitative versus qualitative. Uh, Generally, quantitatively meaningful descriptions are better. So not being too vague. Yep, you missed the target, or yeah, a little harder, a little easier, doesn't make much sense. Whereas you're off by about a foot. So just go to the left a foot or whatever whatever the cues are necessary. But be quantitative, but not too precise. Oh, you're off by a millimeter, right? And it's like, oh, come on. So be mindful of that. The verbal cues, some good aspects to sort of consider. Focus on the critical features of the skill. Hopefully, for most of you, for all of you, this is very intuitive kind of information, obvious kind of things, right? State things succinctly, 3 to 4 word phrases. Don't get too long-winded. Limit the number of verbal cues and be repetitive with the cues that you use, right? So if you select the right ones, which you should, you're the expert, you're the teacher in this case, right? Use those repeatedly. And then finally, attentional focus. So where should focus be directed to? And that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. So are we looking to focus on ourselves when performing a skill, or focusing on what we're performing the skill on, right? So internal on ourselves versus external on what we are trying to accomplish. And so the Bliss border hypothesis was some research done that sort of described this phenomenon called paralysis by analysis. And the idea is that, yeah, the over-analysis and overthinking on trying to place too much emphasis on instructions can cause people to freeze. And so that paralysis by analysis kind of is where that term came from. The action effect hypotheses that came from some of their work determined that the best control of actions comes with attention. So the consequences of this action effect hypothesis pretty much came to a conclusion that when we focus our attention externally, our outcome is better. So internal focus of attention, in the case of this sort of sliding device that they have a picture of on the bottom right hand of the screen here, research was done where the subjects were asked to either focus on their feet and moving their feet, right, and sort of their attentional focus was on the feet and keeping their energy towards, moving your feet will help you then move side to side, versus external focus attention, where the researchers then had the learners focus on the sides of the device, right, on each end. So you're just trying to move your feet to the other end, and they provided, I don't know exactly what the cues were. The outcome, right, of this research was by far, well, not by far, but by a significant margin, that when focus was external, telling the subjects to focus outside of their body, the outcome of their movement, that type of verbal instruction was more beneficial. So just to rephrase it, right? So in this individual, right, we had these perceptual consequences, internal focus of attention versus external focus of attention. Be mindful of this. This could always come up on a quiz, right? That the external focus of attention had a better outcome. So verbal instructions, remember we're talking about verbal instructions directed towards that external focus, with external focus, have better outcomes for learners in this case. Is it always the case? Research tends to be relatively consistent in this area. In your textbook, there's a table that compares or gives some examples of internal and external focus for various skills. So, throwing a ball, internal focus would be, focusing on your arm, right? You want to, at your shoulders, you want to sort of throw your elbow back behind, get your hand behind your head, versus the external focus would be just, you want the ball to kind of be in this line of that whatever object. And so going through this list, go through it, spend a minute just checking it out and getting the idea of what the difference between internal and external focus is. Understanding that generally, right, for you all in your coaching and clinicianal and teaching types of careers that you already have or going into, that external focus verbal cues tend to be more effective. Some more research was done by McNevin, Shea, and Wolf on the distance effects of this focus, right? And so not only was it determined that external focus was more effective than internal, well, if the external focus is really close to the body or really far away from the body, is there going to be a difference? And, you know, to a certain degree, this feels like splitting hairs. It's like, really, if I'm giving someone instructions, if I have them focus too close to their body, they won't learn as quickly as if I have them focus further away or farther away. Yeah, that's kind of the conclusions of this research. So beneficial learning, so the distance of effect from body, the farther away the better. And so in this research, this McNevin and Shea research, they had this balancing board, and they had different areas of verbal instruction that were telling or having subjects focus in different areas. The far outside, far inside, and then near. And so at conclusions of the study, the two far areas of focus had the least number of errors, and that's kind of what you're looking at for success here, right? And so the conclusions are, yeah, the farther away you focus, the better the learning. Good stuff. All right, moving on to visual demonstration. So verbally, right, covered it. Now let's talk about the visual stuff. Visual demonstrations are typically essential, right? They should complement and not necessarily replace verbal instructions, but you can kind of say the same with verbal, right? If given the choice of one or the other, it'd be hard to pick. And then I think in both situations, either way, you'd want both of them together. So verbal should complement visual, and visual should complement verbal. So getting into visual demonstrations, there's a lot of different sort of ideas of how to successfully provide visual demonstrations, right? The model needs to demonstrate things correctly, and that's sort of a no-brainer. And there are characteristics. There's some Bandura stuff in your text that I don't cover in the lecture. Know the Bandura kind of ideas that define these visual characteristics, visual demonstration characteristics, but there's more specific things here that we're going to talk about. And one is the characteristics of the demonstration model. So it doesn't matter who's giving the demonstration. Usually there's no choice, right? It's usually the coach or the teacher. But given the choice, let's see how different, and research has been done, right? Let's understand how different models affect the outcome of the learner. And so, so one of these characteristics is the model's status. So does their social status, and that's more their, you know, how are they perceived by others within the context of the skill that they're demonstrating? Does that have an effect on learning? Well, the conclusions are, yeah, there is some effect, but it's pretty weak. And so the text mentions McCullough's ladder study, and basically this is a study done where subjects were given a visual demonstration by an individual on how to do some sort of intricate, complicated ladder task. And one group of individuals is told that the person given the demonstration was an expert and they're really good at this and they're the best. The other group was given the exact same video with the exact same model, but the difference was that they were told instead of the model being an expert, that the model wasn't really that good. What do you think the outcome was? Well, in McCullough's ladder study, the group that had the higher status model had better learning in the end. Again, the effect was relatively weak, and this is not consistently supported in the research, so it's kind of a tweener type of thing. Skill level of the model, and so this isn't social status, this is the actual skill level of the model. So Adams did some research, and the idea put forward was, let's separate models into a couple different sort of categories. Let's have expert models, those that truly are skilled at performance, and let's have what we're going to call the learning model. And learning model is someone who's not a total novice, they're still learning, so they demonstrate good form and procedures, and they also occasionally demonstrate bad form and procedures. Additionally, and I don't want to forget, and so in this research from Adams, they determined that having the learning models was a more effective way to help individuals learn. come up with your own guesses as to why, but it's, it's kind of obvious stuff. When an individual sees someone who's learning, they get different ideas of how a task is performed. The person learning, seeing the learning model, can relate to them better, and maybe that increases motivation, thinking, hey, if they can do it, maybe I can too. Whereas when they see expert models, if you had a Tiger Woods or somebody like that demonstrating a golf swing, back in the day, I know now it's very much not relevant, but if you had someone like that, modeling a golf swing, it might be, you're going to see it just their way, and maybe that isn't necessarily the best way. And because they've done it so much and they've already learned it so well, there won't be much variation or flexibility in your learning sort of demonstrations. Feedback was also a big deal in terms of the model, and universally feedback was seen as a positive thing. Feedback given from the models about performance was important, and had a positive effect on learning. So this is table 10.3, comparing what the model should represent. So we're comparing the expert to the learning model. Authors go out of their way to provide a table demonstrating the differences between these types of models. Spend a couple minutes and get to know this table just a little bit, right? Just know the difference between an expert and a learner. Kind of obvious stuff. Makes sense. Another characteristic is the similarity of the model. And so this kind of has a little bit of overlap with the learning model, but isn't always the case. And so the similarity of the model is, how much does the learner relate to the model? And so the learner's response to models considered similar to themselves is usually positive, right? It gives them a feeling of self-efficacy. Hey, if they can do it, I can too, kind of thing, like I just mentioned, right? And when that is increased, motivation goes up, the persistence of, you guys know all about motivation now, increased motivation will usually lead to increased learning. So finding a model that is a peer of the learner is quite often an effective strategy. You watch some of these infomercials that you see on late at night, sometimes not late at night, right? And they kind of do those same sort of things, at least in promoting their product, right? And they'll show the expert doing things. They'll have the learning models on there doing it as well. And you can kind of tell that a lot of these instructional videos that they're trying to sell take advantage of a lot of these concepts. Hey, we want to, we're selling a product to teach you how to do that perfect golf swing. And it isn't just our expert pro who's doing it. Here's some learning models who are doing it as well. And so, in the real world, these concepts are definitely in use. So the summary sort of on how to provide effective modeling of skills. There is a decent summary section at the end of the chapter going over this. Use of learning models can be effective and is often more effective than learning expert models. When using learning models, using any models to be honest, but when using learning models, make sure you get some feedback. Sometimes it's really effective, and again, getting back to these infomercials, you'll see this as well. Using a member of the group as a learning model. So you may have a group of individuals learning, and then it's like, hey, why don't we pick Susie out of the group here, and you can provide us the demonstration of this. Well, immediately she becomes a learning model. She probably isn't an expert. She's just right there with you in your group. You're like, wow, I could have got picked too, right? So that is a really effective strategy, and that happens in coaching all the time, of course, right? We're learning how to, how to do this baseball skill. Well, let's take one of the players and have them do the demonstration so he or she can model it for the rest of the team. And so that's a pretty effective strategy. Some other effective strategies, mixed demonstrations. So if you have the opportunity to mix in the experts and the learners, that is somewhat intuitive. Provide demonstrations throughout practice. We'll get to more practice stuff later on, chapter 11, I believe. And arrange learners for most effective viewing angles. You're thinking, really? Yeah, really. So make sure that you can see the demonstrations. Make sure that you're mindful of your learners and whether or not they have a good angle to see the skill being performed. And so I'm not going to test you on this, at least this graphic, but you should be aware of the concept that, yeah, if you are instructing, and this person in red is the instructor, and the people in the green little stick figures are the learners. The top example is you have a group in front sitting, you have a group kneeling behind them, and in the back you have them standing. Why? So everyone can see. If you have a single or smaller groups, maybe a half circle type of arrangement, so all the learners are about the similar distance from the instructor, so no one's at a disadvantage for that. So yes, it seems obvious and almost silly to talk about, but it is meaningful. And when you start to put all these pieces together, not just in this chapter, but the entire semester, that formula for sort of optimum teaching of motor skills, whatever the context is, starts to present itself. And you don't want to ignore any of them because they all play just a little bit. And then if you add a little bit to a little bit, all of a sudden you could be that coach or that instructor or that therapist or clinician, whoever you are, who's having great success because you're able to apply this stuff. Finally, let's talk about some newer sort of things out there in the world of demonstrations. This idea of mirror neurons has been talked about quite a bit lately. And so an interesting discovery has been made where there's neurons that will fire under two different circumstances. So neurons get activated, right? We know neurons are important for not only performance of motor skills, but also for memory. And so when you perform an action, a skill, right, those neurons are active. But what's these mirror neurons are capable of is that when you observe another individual, animal, they talked about animal studies with this, it's hard to measure in humans, that when another animal performs the same action, your neurons, these mirror neurons, will also fire. So just through watching a visual demonstration, your neurons are engaging in the process, and memory traces and learning can actually occur and potentially improve performance because of the activity of these mirror neurons. And so the human brain has been determined to have multiple systems of motor neurons, and they are engaged for both motor and also social behaviors. So so it's a thing. Kind of cool. Not tons of graphics in the book, so we'll finish the lecture off with this one. That's it for chapter 10. See you next time.